All right, as usual, we're going to take a little bit of a last session review, and it probably needs to be plural here, last session's review, because I want to just continue to build upon today because we actually finalize with all three components about the kind of the method or the process or the approach of kind of the ecosystem method or approach itself. So going way back, we started off with this identification of a social problem. And right away, we kind of notice this issue where a problem is really a name we give not to the problem, but to the effects the problem causes. And so because of that, the content is normally about the things that we perceive or see, such as the symptoms or the effects themselves. But we tried to flip the script a little bit right off from the very beginning to say, the problem is actually this kind of tangled web, this interacting set of kind of problems themselves. And those problems really are better defined by the way they're structured or the way they're organized as opposed to their content. So that's the first change we actually began to explore. And the idea there was any kind of social problem we think about is not one thing. So we can't expect to address it by only doing one thing either. So whether your social problems are around, as yours are, domestic violence or post-secondary graduation rates, we're also talking about childcare as seen through a post-secondary lens. Some of you are looking at the intersection between education and community itself. There's some great intersection work about biodiversity and health that Jessica's looking at. Thriving downtown work with Leslie. Rural educational access with Manisha and her great work. And then with Maureen and Dave, mental health and kind of Native American equity, but maybe even some scholar work as well, respectively. So no matter what the problem that any of you chosen to focus on, it's not one thing. As we kind of say, it's a systems thing. We chose a metaphor since we could kind of back up from the beginning. And we said, let's not choose something that's mechanistic. Let's choose something that is really more attributable to the kind of problem we're approaching, which is probably more of an ecosystem, something that's organic and natural and dynamic and ever-forming. And we thought through this approach, we could begin to take these different kinds of problems that actually compose the issue we're working on and begin to place them in the homes where they belong. And we did that because we reminded you that problems are actually patterns of cause and effect. We may not know what the content of problems tomorrow will be. We can argue philosophically about today's kind of problems that we have if we focus on the content. But if we focus on their structure, it gives us an opportunity to have a different conversation, a more objective conversation. And thanks to complexity science, there are only a few structures that we really need to kind of recognize. Not that it's exhaustive, but at least it's instructive, and it really gets us a long way to approaching problems in a different way. We kind of then began to say within our habitats, we have two kind of ordered habitats, the clear and the complicated habitats, where things are kind of known or at least knowable. And then we have two unordered habitats, the complex, which is unknown because cause and effect is tightly wound together and forms a circle, and the complicated, where initially cause and effect are completely unknown. That was the first kind of session that we had. And then last week, we actually came together and said, okay, now each of these habitats has its kind of preferred way of being addressed. And we looked at this hierarchy, if you recall, that we called the 4 ways of treating a problem. And it really, as we said, was a hierarchy of effectiveness, starting from the least effective and moving toward the most effective. We looked at housing and homelessness as a potential kind of example, and we looked at the problem of the different ways we could approach it. The first being absolve it. The AB prefix, meaning obviously move away from, really was an indication that this means we kind of ignore the problem. Maybe we forget it, we hope it goes away, but we decide purposely or implicitly not to engage with the problem as well. We try to ignore the problem and see what will happen on its own accord, but we absolve the problem by moving away. The second approach we talked about was trying to bring things to scale, and we called that, we're going to resolve it, resolve the problem. And again, the prefix here is instructive, RE, meaning we're going to do it again. We've done it before, seemed to work, we're going to repeat it. And we're going to repeat it using standards to try to bring it to scale. We're going to get the most things to the most people to do the most good. The third approach was we're actually going to work to address the problem at the individual level by solving it. We're going to solve the problem in a customized, individualized way, looking for effectiveness rather than efficiency. But we're going to solve it for person by person by person by person, continually solving the same problems over and over and again. Perhaps even through our organizations actually celebrating how many problems, the same problem that we actually identified and addressed last year. Here, though, there was a noble goal of the right. How do we get the right things to the right people to achieve the right ends? But we said instead of solving individual problems over and over again, there's one more approach to consider. And this is the one that we kind of tabled and called to dissolve. Again, the prefix here means to not solve. And if you're not going to solve something, well, what are you going to do? Well, you're actually going to dissolve it by actually underlying conditions, changing those conditions, and actually kind of shaping those conditions that caused the problem in the first place, hoping to eliminate them. So those were the 4 ways that we identified. And if you think about it, thinking about the hierarchy of effectiveness, it goes from least to most. And the first 3 work in the system itself, which is where a lot of our work and most of our systems takes place actually today. But the 4th and the final approach in the hierarchy, dissolve, was really about working on the system itself. And that's what it made it fundamentally different from the other approaches. So from having those, we tried to see if we could organize those perhaps best onto our habitat map. But I put this, I think, really important summary slide because I think in a nutshell, it tries to draw the distinction of what makes these 4 ways different. Again, absolve, we're ignoring the problem and moving away from it. Resolve, we're treating the symptoms. We're managing the problem on behalf of the community. We're helping the community cope with the problem, but only addressing symptoms. Solve is different because for the first time, we're actually working on causes and we're solving those causes, but solving the same causes over and over. So here we work on the cause, not the symptom. And finally, what makes dissolve different is you're eliminating the conditions that cause the problem in the first place. So you're actually eliminating causes so we don't have to keep addressing the same problems today and tomorrow and otherwise. So that's the key. Ignore them. Treat the symptoms, treat the causes, eliminate the causes. That's fundamentally the distinction we were trying to get at. And so from that, we're able to kind of now put the 2 maps together and realize that clear problems can be resolved because cause and effect is known. It's an ordered system. Complicated problems can be solved because the cause and effect is knowable, not by everyone, but by some, in which case it is semi-ordered as well. And so you can totally take that and solve those kind of issues. But the other problems, like complex problems, because cause and effect is intertwined and reflexive and circular, cause and effect is unknown. There, the proper course is to probe the situation, see how it responds in that relationship with it, and then see if we can't redesign those conditions to dissolve the problem itself. And then we said we're under chaotic, those are an unknown knowable pattern. The best we can do is act, respond, sense, respond again, react again until we can maybe discern a pattern and move it to the complex space and begin to work on it from there. So with that, we actually ended up not only with our habitat about what problems by structure we're going to put where, but also what's the best approach that each problem actually responds to, whether it be the management or resolution of that problem, whether it be solving it on an individualized basis, or whether it be trying to dissolve it to ever improve the system itself. Also triage, as we kind of talked about quickly, right? You top down, command and control that, see if you can shift it back onto one of the other kind of habitats up above. The key we were trying to get at is we want to try to approach these problems and these in an appropriately contextual way, making sure the type of the structure of the problem and the way we address it are in alignment, because that's one of the first critical mistakes we can have is having those 2 things out of alignment. Today, we'll look at kind of the second major thing we can get out of alignment when we look at structure. So that's what we're trying to get, the problem itself in alignment with the way that we actually respond to it. For your practice work, and we're going to give you some time to talk again with your peers, and then we'll come back and look at some of your peers' work and kind of look at how they kind of tried to approach it. We just ask you essentially the same thing in 2 different ways. Looking at your system of focus, can you identify activities of work where the problem may be being absolved? Or can you find places and examples where really the symptoms are being managed or problems are being solved on an individualized basis, or even if there's a mechanism already in place that's actually trying to dissolve causes by continuously improving the system, the way it's designed, and the way people work together. So the first thing was just looking out for the activities. Do we even see those activities going on? And then we tried to take it one additional step to see if you could start to name some of those stakeholders who are actually doing those kinds of work by the description of what their kind of work and activities actually look like. And that's going to feed in largely to today's homework, where we're actually going to try to finalize the first three sections with kind of an ecosystem map where we're bringing all three of those things together. So the first one, do we find the activities present or not? And the second one, who's doing each of those activities? Just trying to give us the best basis we can so we can begin to draw a map. We had this worksheet on page 9 that we kind of encouraged you to work from to see if you could begin to place different kinds of stakeholders doing different kinds of work in each of the circles or the contacts themselves. And then we essentially kind of asked you, to cite what observations you kind of found, take a picture, send it to us. And thank you. I think everyone kind of got their work into it. And we're going to review a few of those afterward. In the meantime, though, we're going to give you some time to actually have a conversation with the other members of the cohort, exchanging that time. We got about 20 minutes for this. So Amber, if we can put 20 on the clock, and if you would, please give us any instructions for the breakout rooms today that we may need. Say thank you. As always, as we kind of told you in the beginning, we want to try to preview and share as much of your work as possible. I think the important thing is we uploaded the slides this morning into the Dropbox under session 3. And so we put everyone who turned in their homework up to the kind of post date, even just a few hours ago, on that. So you have the ability, as always, to see everyone's kind of body of work. We don't always have time to get all through each of the bodies themselves. So we try to stagger you from who went last for the last time and try to see if we can make you first this time so everyone has equal opportunity to share across the cohort and across the time period of the academy. So if we don't get to, apologize, but we got a lot to get done today for the second half and trying to finalize the third part of the approach. So with that, let's dig into a few things that we saw of interest that look great. Lily, you went last the last time, so we popped you up first. Can you kind of tell us here what your overview, what your thinking was, and kind of how you address the homework?
Well, I feel like people probably used your beautiful Venn diagram, and I didn't. So I apologize if this is hard to process, but yeah, so I'm doing childcare at the state level from a post-secondary lens. And I was just chatting with Joy, who's previously worked in early childhood, which was just really awesome to talk with her. But yeah, I was trying to, and I also don't really work directly in childcare or with direct childcare providers. So we are early in our process of engaging our stakeholders and doing some of that partnership development and real asset mapping to understand kind of our current state picture and where we are. But I do know a little bit about our barriers, and those barriers.
Lily, if you can hear us, I think you froze up on our end. We'll give you a moment to see if it can recover. Okay, we will come back to Lily. We'll make a programming change here quickly, and we will return upon her return. Joy and Kelly, beautiful looking diagram. Who would like to go, Joy or Kelly first?
Sure, Kelly, you wanna go for it this time? I think I described it last time.
Well, we can tag team it.
All right, let's do that.
So we focused on one of the complex problems that we had in last week's homework, which was the insufficient and transient trust and relationships between community and education. And when Joy and I were mapping this out, we realized that in some ways we were very lucky in that we have organizations and people that cross all of them: managing, solving, chaotic, triage, and dissolving it. And so I think we feel advantaged to have some already working on dissolving some of this. As I was telling Maureen, I think the outcome of the election locally for us will probably shift how some of this looks. But as of when we turned it in on Friday, this is how it looked. We didn't identify specific people or specific programs on this, but Joy and I do have a list of that. We found that it was easier for us to talk about it more generically, given some of those kinds of issues that are facing our community.
I think one of the other interesting pieces of conversation between Kelly and I is something that kept popping up in both of our minds when we worked individually and then came back together was the fact that lots of times, lots of the pieces, the threads of our social problem, when we work on the absolve it kind of piece, we just wait until we're in the chaotic part. We kind of had a hard time kind of dealing with that part, that we just like push it off to the side until we have to triage. And so we had a moment that we had to kind of talk through that a little bit.
But I would say, I'm just going to shout out Joy here. When she says we tend to just sort of push it off, she doesn't mean her organization and mine. That's our community.
Understood. I love both comments. I thought, Kelly, what you said, with the election coming up, last Friday, things have changed. That's why they call it a complex dynamic system. I mean, it's always changing from day to day. No doubt about that. And Joy, I love that. I think a lot of systems do, instead of proactively building an infrastructure to kind of coordinate and dissolve problems, they just wait till they're always in fire mode, right, in order to kind of address those kind of issues. And so I think that's a excellent part that, in many ways, we all do have the chaotic that's always seen there, that's been built out. And it may be our primary way of actually fixing the system, but our only way, which is probably not ideal, right? To be under that kind of stress and pressure and not have any knowability about causality, where we just have to continue to throw things at the wall to see what kind of takes. But I think those are both great insights. It's also exciting to hear that you've got specific people that can kind of be attached to that, because that's where we're heading after today. We're really talking about organizing people and not just organizations. But this was the proper way, I think, to just say, are these activities being done, and kind of who at the broader level need to be done. So I think you did a fantastic job. So I thought it was great. Thank you. Lily, as I see it, I'm going to try to back this up if I can. And maybe I can't. Let's give it one more shot. All right, Lily, sorry you locked up on us. I hope you're back. I hope your connection's stable, and we will let you continue. Sorry.
I'm back. So I'm not sure what I said, but working on childcare from the post-secondary lens, and we're kind of early in our process of engaging our stakeholders. So who are the partners? It's our post-secondary institutions. But then from their communities, it'll be their network of childcare center partners, other community-based organizations that provide care. Adult education is a big partner for us in this space, because they also have a vested interest in exploring increasing access to childcare for their parenting students. And they also have funding that will allow them to increase access. And so we're trying to think about some of the major barriers that face our system from the state level, and that is, not enough spots for kiddos, not enough wages for workers, which means that we don't have enough workers, which means that it's going to be hard to have more spots for kiddos, and then also keeping costs down. And so if you want to increase wages, but keep costs down for families, that's also very hard to achieve both of those goals. And so a very complex challenge that we have. And I was just trying to kind of think back to where are we in our current state picture of things that have attempted to address some of these big systemic issues. And so I kind of identified a few of the legislative recent laws that have gone through. One is that people that work in childcare centers can access the CCAP benefit, the childcare benefit, regardless of their family income, so even the dual earner income. So they have free childcare. So that hopefully bumps up that earning wage or the benefit of working in that field. Also, they have access to free post-secondary education in the field if they're pursuing an early childhood credential, which does not have a huge ROI for pursuing that credential, but it does improve the quality of the childcare experiences. So there is interest from the legislature in, incentivizing those programs to be completed. And then they've invested a little bit of money in innovation funds to, I think, from the complex side of, problem dissolution, like what can we try? What are some good ideas? We need to kind of think about this, like try this and see what happens, and then see if it's, what else can we do? And then also trying to engage business in as a partner at the table through tax credits and providing some kind of support in the childcare space. So our work is going to really engage this network of partners, and it's going to potentially be more at the kind of local regional level or at the community college, like individual community college will have a network that they're trying to think through their stakeholder mapping, and then what can they do specifically with their prospective students to identify the barriers that they're facing and then work through maybe solve for one, dissolve for many types of solution or dissolution of the challenges that they're facing. We're a little early. I wish I could have brainstormed more, but that's what I got.
No, this is great. I really like the current state. It's staggering when you see 15,000 childcare centers being closed, and particularly it's always the wrong areas as well to get to your childcare deserts. So I thought you always see horror statistics around this area, and that's yet another one I think to add to the portfolio. I love the fact that you did kind of identify the key essential issues that are most paramount right now, which is awesome. It's a great, I think, recording, which I think is going to be helpful later on about policy that's being put in place and things that are being kind of, that's always those invisible issues that sometimes just building awareness is so critical on. I think that's wonderful. 2-gen model, great. I'll be curious to learn how that goes. I know some other communities trying to work that same approach. And so they're just getting started on it as well. So there's some really interesting experiments I think you've got going on. And of course, the opportunity in the spring to bring this together and interconnect, support one, to have that conversation. There'll be a lot to learn. So I think hopefully the timing's good for this academy to helping kind of, set some thinking and some practices in place to get ready for spring. Looks great.
Thank you.
I think you did a very nice job. Thank you so much. Okay, let me, Jim, why don't we take a pass on this, kind of tell us how you laid this out, what you were trying to achieve.
Sure, thanks, Jack. Like Lily, I didn't put it on the Venn diagram either, kind of laid it out in a way that my brain, I guess, thinks. But in going through the different problems, the system that I was looking at was my prior position as a superintendent and working within a school system and working with a board and some politics and stuff involved, whatever the case might be, and then trying to improve a graduation rate at the same time. So this system focused specifically on the school corporation and then the secondary school part of that corporation, and then graduation rates in particular. And trying to look at it that way in managing the problems, there's some clear problems, I think, that the corporation administration and as a whole takes the lead on and makes sure that there are ways to get training accomplished for all staff members. Universal Design for Learning, UDL, is an instructional framework that we implemented within the school corporation, and then just recently created a cohort model at the high schools where a team of people would work at a grade level and follow students all the way through their senior year in high school. So they would have kids come in as freshmen, work with that same group of kids as with freshmen, sophomores, juniors, and seniors. So with them for 4 years, they get to know the child, they get to know the parents, and in a big high school, this seems to work. But from the district level, it's making sure that the resources, the systems are in place to allow that to happen. From a solving problems and getting into the complicated issues is where that cohort model, different resources, specialized staff came into play of looking at individual differences, individual needs, and finding ways to address those individual needs whether it's adding more resources, finding more resources, and or getting the family engaged in one way or another. And then lastly, in terms of bringing a coordinated approach to dissolving problems with complex issues, this was the building level. So we kind of go from the corporation to the classroom and the individual student to the building level. We're at the school corporation. They have something called continuous improvement councils in each of their buildings, a very key stakeholder group that's across departments and across different kinds of staff members. And they look at the data that they have, get into root causes, and then try to address those root causes in order to dissolve the problem. So that's the way that I was looking at this particular situation and lined it up here. The rest of it was just a summary there at the bottom, the summary of differences in terms of one being managing focuses on scalable, efficient implementation across all students. Solving provides individualized, flexible responses for individual student needs, and then dissolving reexamines and redesigns the system itself to remove root barriers and prevent recurring issues.
Very nice. Yeah, and just to be clear, you never have to use the tools we give you in a true UDL spirit. If linear thinkers, you be linear as you want to be.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
we provide all
Yeah.
sorts of tools, but we accept these practice assignments in whatever form you feel most comfortable.
There you go. My chosen expression of my understanding of the
Indeed. Well, what I love is you reiterated what the role was of each of these three key activities, specifically called out, the stakeholders, the key ways they're organizing themselves and key initiatives that bring that to life, and then the goal, and then summarizing the goal. Because it's really nice. The summary of the distinctions of the differences over to the right, I think are really nice. Well, they're well put in place. It's also reassuring to know our local school corporation has got a lot of great assets in place.
There are a lot.
To try to tackle this. So that's wonderful. I think you did a really nice job. And I appreciate the linear thinking with role, application, goal, summary. So you can tell you're a C-level executive in a school.
There you go.
Very nice. Thank you, Jim.
Sure.
Appreciate
Thanks,
it. Cassie, if you may recall last time, Cassie introduced us to her system of focus with domestic violence and its key components, but there's some new things for her. So I have, just so you know, Cassie, I have got both this and kind of your reflection paper. So however you want to speak.
Oh, that's a great question. How do I want to speak to this? This was a great exercise for me because we actually did a survey earlier this year of the organizations within kind of that social sector working in domestic violence. And we thought we had designed this awesome survey that was going to tell us a lot. And then it actually just revealed a lot of unexpected problems. And one was, we sent it to these organizations and asked them, like, what are you doing really well? What do you feel like you are the expert at? You are doing fantastic. And then what are you doing because you see a need, even though it's maybe not your specialty? And then what are you not providing, but you see the need for? And we saw every group kind of answer the same, but in a really confusing way. So for example, like all of these organizations under Manage It, we're like, we're awesome at case management. And we're like, you can't possibly be, because we are not seeing any interagency referrals. So if you were really experts at this, we would see a lot different results than what we're seeing. And so it gave us a lot of really interesting information. And we feel like a lot of organizations managing the immediate problem in a large systematic way. And we feel like there are groups who are focused on specific populations and specific individuals, trying to provide those really specific individualized solutions. And just feeling this major gap in the dissolve it space and knowing that that's where the women's fund is trying to be. And some of the tension in that being, these organizations are gathering consistently in certain places. Like for example, one is through our mayor's commission, and then another through our county prosecuting attorney's office. And these groups are supposed to be in word, the place for dissolution to happen. But the problem is that the issues are coming from the system where the table is, and no one at the table feels like they can call out the table they're sitting at. And so it's just this really ineffective gathering in use of resources. And I have grown increasingly frustrated over the last few years of sitting at these tables going, we have the people here who can help us resolve some issues, but they don't feel empowered to be sincere and honest about the problems they see. And so that's where my point of tension is right now. And I'm leading into this experience to figure out, is there a way to build the relationships to help maybe just scooch that table to another building and so they feel like they can have those conversations, or to come alongside the people leading those. And yes, just feeling that frustration of like, the right people are at the table, but the people in power in those situations maybe aren't allowing true change to happen or don't understand how to facilitate the group to get there.
I so appreciated your note. Help me out, the acronym in the dissolve. Is that the government, the table that's been set through the government?
So no, that's actually the Indiana Coalition Against Domestic Violence. So
Thank
this
you.
is
State
statewide,
level? Got it.
state level, and they're very, I don't want to speak ill of them. They're very focused on statewide legislation, which is great, and we will see the impact of that. But when it comes to working with the local organizations to get them on the same page and using the same vocabulary and things like that, that's not what they serve. So we know that their actions impact us on a policy level and on a systems level. But we don't see that a whole lot in our immediate community.
You're right. Thank you for making that clarification. I was confusing it with the thing on the next page, which we'll get to in just a moment, about the locally convened part, which I thought you did such a great job talking about the power dynamics. When it's your boss, the employer in the room, how critical are you going to be, of progress being made from the area. So it always talks about being careful about where certain tables are set, to use your excellent words on that, composition and so forth. I do think this ICADV has a really important role in the dissolve function, since they do work on policy and it's system design work. I think they are a piece of it, but I think you're right. There's a local piece that may be missing. What I saw here is the survey responses, and just when you said didn't tell us what we're looking for, it maybe told you what you really needed to hear about the lack of interagency referrals, interactions, and connectivity on that, as well as just the backlog with therapists actually being trained on that. I love the candid answer about who's resolving problems. No one. I mean, that is very, very typical when you kind of get to these areas. So I think that's right. And there it is. That's what I thought was the Mayor's Commission for Domestic Violence, Sexual Harassment, and Rape. That's the one I was looking for, about the complexity of having a table set only within the city, or by the city, at least initially, so it appears they have ownership. And then your reflections, I thought, are really good, because I think when you get together, hopefully the Academy is a place to practice difficult conversations before you have to have them, which you always do. But I think this dichotomy you found about who says they're doing these things versus who's really doing it is one of those conversations I think any system early on has to kind of undertake. And there are really easy ways to facilitate that by just telling everyone what the definition, and just having a round robin conversation where everyone sees where they fit and why they think they fit there.
Yeah.
And so it helps people draw the distinctions between those different activities, and perhaps even having themselves see, well, actually, based on that definition, I really do more of this, and it's okay if I don't do it all. Or it's nice to know there are other people doing that, so maybe I can even focus and hone in my programmatic mission a little bit more. So that's a very common, it's the reason why some of these tools were actually created, were to have those kind of very difficult conversations between, what we think and what they think, what's really happening versus what they say. And then the importance of, yes, so many of these issues have to do with regional and statewide, organizations and different regional areas of service delivery among all these areas. So, hate to say it, you might want to think a little bit more broadly about just the county and Allen County, and think about a few more of the counties who maybe also have a little bit more leverage with some of these providers, if there was a regional approach. Just putting it out there, because I thought it was an excellent insight that you put forth, and the last one I thought was great as well. Any feedback on that?
No, that's great. I'm glad it made sense outside of my brain. So
Oh, no, and all I thought some really exciting. Well, I mean, there's lots of opportunities right here. I mean, you start to see, training for more therapists. How do we increase interactions and referrals? Again, I know you said when we kind of talk about, the housing first month, we always say, thinking about solve one, extend to many for community solutions, and built for zero and some of those approaches. We always say, well, just don't call them that. Just say, let's get together. Right. Let's address issues, by domestic case by case, and then let's take what we learn and improve the whole thing. If you just keep in plain language like that, sometimes you can break through those barriers. So keep up with it. And then I was excited to see that you've got a meeting coming up, that you'll be able to kind of have some of these insights and things addressed. So I think it's all great opportunity.
fingers crossed.
Yeah, fingers crossed. Well done. I was very impressed with what I saw. Keep your spirits up on that. Okay, Maureen, what do we have here?
For a second. So we are working on behavioral health and providing mental health or substance use services in the community. We actually had our behavioral health regional action team today. And it was so interesting kind of seeing how that group went today and some of the challenges that we are facing and how a lot of these organizations are still in that managing space. We definitely need direct service. People are managing crisis, and that's kind of where my arrows are going. Managing those crisis calls, managing Baker Acts, working with community partners to have different organizations meet a sheriff officer when there is a potential Baker Act, and being able to provide that resource, but then having our partners think that one level up. And how that system level change is, and being able to think of like, well, why is this person continuously being Baker acted, or why are they continuing to have these challenges? So that was really apparent after doing this and getting the feedback from Dakota. But just even seeing this in our regional action team meeting today is, yes, there are organizations working in that managing space. And fortunately, through our coalition, they've been able to help with referrals and be able to work across organizations, whether it be in the nonprofit world, the for-profit, government entities, and even the hospital system. But what is missing is just that collective idea, because right now it's like they're meeting in the coalition and still very one organizational mindset, and that my organization can do this. And for example, there was one organization today was speaking on the different partnerships they have and being able to meet out with the sheriff department. And they said, well, our lead time is 60 minutes, being able to get there and meet that officer with that individual who's going to be Baker acted within a 60-minute time frame. And in my mind, I'm thinking, okay, if they had the relationship with other organizations and other partners who's closer in proximity, how can we get somebody there in 5 minutes and then say, hey, I'll be there as soon as I can, and we can work on this together. And then, as I mentioned, just that one level up is, why are these individuals continuously being Baker acted? Unfortunately, right now, our space is in the crisis care. Mental health concerns is just in crisis right now. We're not even at that prevention space yet. So we just, in our area in the state of Florida, we don't have enough providers. We have extreme wait lists. So there's a lot of issues that are going on, but I think the more and more we meet with these partners and really try to identify, okay, how can we work together first on identifying this? Then once we're at that space where we're actually working together, we can start to dissolve those root causes of what's actually going on. I put ourselves as the backbone organization in the Health and Wellness Coalition in that dissolving space, because that's really our role. That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to bring partners together for them to be able to see the system, because our system is broken, and how are we going to fix it? And as I mentioned to Kelly too, one of the really interesting projects we're going to be working on is just that continuum of care. And for partners to identify where they're falling on that, and then what gaps are identified, just seeing where that continuum is. And I think from then we'll be able to see, okay, here's where some of these root challenges are coming from.
Great overview. Really, really well. I was delighted to see collaboratory was put in the spot, and you are viewing it, the work that way. So that was tremendous. Love the one level up thinking and your application to kind of be able to apply that. What I'd like to do, Dakota, without putting you on the spot, since you work so closely with collaboratory and is there anything you'd like to kind of contribute or say, having you have a lot of knowledge on the ground?
I mean, I thought it was really well done, and Maureen and I have had some good back and forth together. I think one of the other pieces that she and I discussed a little bit is how easy it is to fall into the two things. One, how easy it is to fall into the trap of thinking that when we're implementing prevention-based strategies, that is systems dissolution work. And sometimes we gather people and say, hey, how do we prevent, someone from needing to access, crisis or getting into a mental health crisis? And, that's kind of, it's important work, but also all those strategies could also be labeled into the manage and solve and dissolve kind of categories as well. So it's one of those things as a facilitator, as a backbone organization to kind of know, what it is that we're talking about, what it is that we're working on. Does the preventative arm of the system also need systems redesign as well as the crisis part of the system? So sometimes helping our stakeholders make that distinction. And then the other thing that we were talking about, it's a little bit of foreshadowing for you, Maureen, is really about teaming, there's oftentimes where we say, yeah, we all kind of come together to try to dissolve these problems together. But, is there really a true dedicated small team of people that are coming together to really have specific and only conversations around system acts of dissolution? Which we'll kind of get into, I think, as we proceed throughout the academy. But it's really, really great work, Marina, and I know you've been convening a lot of different folks around this, and it's also a very confusing system that needs to be begs for visualizations, truly, to just try to make it clear and present to everybody. So great work.
Thank you. And that was extremely valuable to just get that feedback. As I mentioned, I'm my C student this time around because I'm submitting homework late and I'm like, oh my gosh, we're so busy with stuff. But just to get that feedback today and really understand, my arrow for prevention should actually be coming from that managed side instead of that dissolve side, and just really clearly seeing that, because sometimes you do get lost in, okay, prevention is a good thing. We do want to prevent this, but is it actually looking at that systems level mindset? So, I think training my mind in that, but then also being able to articulate that to our partners as well.
Excellent. Good session, both of you. Thank you. Also, there's a good note from Dakota in the chat about, thinking about kind of that dissolve it and not kind of making the full mistake that we can just only count on, state, national policies and pieces. I hope I didn't get out of tune on that when I was asking about the other thing. I was just thinking, same thing, that is a part of it, but it's not all of it. Making sure we understand that, there's more bodies of work locally that need to be undertaken. So I appreciate that nuance. The other thing I just want to preview, because we're out of town regrettably, but we want to kind of show some other great work that's put on. I think with Leslie here, the new pieces are shown in this kind of goldish kind of print on here to kind of preview. I think you did great work really identifying each of these areas. So we owe you some written feedback as we didn't receive your email. So we will definitely get that to you, Leslie. But what we've seen so far, I think looks great. So I think you definitely tried to identify those organizations doing those particular activities. All right, we're at break. So tell you what, we're about 7, so we can get around 3:15. No, that wouldn't obviously give you your time, but let's try to shoot for about 3:15 to 3:17-ish. We have a lot to do, so we want to get going. But enjoy your break, well deserved, and we'll see you about 10 minutes. Coming back and joining us, this next section. It might be good if you have your handout materials that were sent handy. There's some things I just think a higher resolution are best seen with the materials in front of you rather than on the screen here, depending on your monitor and how you have things configured. So if you have those handy, you might see if you can find those. And we'll begin in just about a minute. So why don't we go ahead and begin. So today we're going to talk on session 3. We're going to finalize kind of the approach section of the academy and spend the next 7 sessions after that merely kind of on the practices themselves, which will focus in a real deep dive, practice-based way on really that dissolution circle itself. What makes it different from the other two circles? How does it really interact with the other two circles? And what are some of the best practices or habits of mind shifts that we have to make to really best operate in them? So that's where we'll be heading. But today we're going to kind of finalize this idea of organizing. And the title kind of says it all about what if we, instead of organizing around problems, which are always changing, and we may not know what, in fact, probably don't know what they're going to be in the future, what if we organized around something a little more stable? Something whose structure, it can actually be known somewhat and how we might approach it. So what if we organized around contexts themselves as opposed to the content of problems? So that's what we're going to explore. If you kind of did that kind of thinking, what might that look like? As you might imagine, there's no one right answer, as we've seen from all the other sessions. We know that there's not one social problem, it's a whole set of problems. There's not one way to best approach a problem. There's a whole kinds of ways and sorts of ways to approach problems. And therefore, you might assume that we are going to kind of take a different path and say there is not one way to organize around these problems. There's a whole multitude of ways. And we're actually going to explore what that might look like. Now, one thing I think it always behooves us to remember is, the systems definition is really how we work together. So just from that definition, it implies the structure and the way of organizing people is something extraordinarily important. And honestly, when we work with most systems initiatives or large-scale collaboratives, their structure many times is the key issue, how they've chosen to approach the problem and the kind of problem they're approaching, and then the organizing structure they chose get out of alignment. And a lot of times they get stuck, or they find themselves without the capability or the capacities to respond to the problem in the appropriate way because of the way they've organized themselves. So that's why we're going to kind of take some glances today at this. So this completes that three-part series, which, first of all, the problem structure. Before you and I walk in the room, problems have a structure, and we use complexity science to kind of narrow down those few structures about clear or complicated and unordered problems, such as complex and chaotic. And we begin to understand the structure problems rather than merely just their content, so we could have a more objective kind of viewpoint about the nature of these problems. But then we said, but that's not it. You also have a response. You and I as leaders kind of get to choose how we're going to approach a particular problem. And that can be in alignment with the problem structure or out of alignment with the problem structure, in which case we can find ourselves, not being nearly as effective as we want to be in addressing these issues. But yet there's still one other decision and choice that we have as leaders that's pretty critical that can be in or out of alignment. And that's the way we've decided to organize people. And even though each of these kind of decisions can be made, independently, it's best if we try to think about these decisions holistically, with each complementing and in alignment with the others. So just because we've broken them in three parts, that was just really for the convenience of making distinctions and helping you understand the different facets of this very complex kind of social problem or social space that systems are built around. But at the end of the day, if we can get these things in alignment, that's what we really consider to be systemness. So today we're going to tackle this bottom one about organizing people. We start where we kind of ended, in that we were able to get different kinds of problems into these different habitats or contexts, and then align those best with the appropriate ways of actually approaching that. So the questions we have today to address are threefold. One, would you organize people differently in each of those three contexts? Said a different way, would you organize people differently if you're going to address something clear versus if you're going to address something complicated versus if you're going to approach something that is complex? So that's the first question we kind of have to address. The second one, if you do think that that's the case for each context, how would you structure these teams of people that would be in there, and what would their work kind of be like? And then finally, to kind of sum that up, what interactions might each team then have to have with the other teams to hold it all together as a system? Remember, we're not trying to fragment the world any longer. We're trying to bring it together holistically and have some coherence around it. So these interactions between the teams become much more important based on what we're trying to do in systems leadership. So that's where we're kind of going to look at these three questions. Last time when we talked about solving problems, we talked about this case study, still available to you in the suggested reading at the root level of the Dropbox. But we looked at this case study by Malcolm Gladwell called $1 Million Murray. Murray Barr lived in Reno, Nevada, cost the city tens of millions of dollars over his lifetime, millions of dollars in a few years. And, and the key thing that Malcolm Gladwell was wrestling with is this trade-off between managing problems and solving problems. And in the article itself, he laid out the thing is there are two different approaches here that are in conflict. They're a trade-off. They're in competition with one another for resources. One of those is managing the problem. And that tends to be a very linear process in terms of the amount of money we invest and the number of people that it actually assists, because we standardize things. We make those products in this very standardized around sameness, and therefore our curve looks very much like a linear curve that we're so used to. But he said when you really think about, that's kind of magic. When you actually get to the solve it part, that's a completely different curve, what we might call a power law curve itself, because it deals with variation. It's that old 80-20 rule, where 80% of the resources may have to be invested in 20% of the population. It's a very, very different problem. And you have to make different decisions, and you have to invest your resources differently for each one of these particular curves. So it forces a trade-off. So what we're now kind of saying is there's some implications between these ways of addressing a problem and whether or not they're interdependent or independent of one another. In this case, one of the biggest ones we'll continually run into is this problem between managing things and solving things. They're a trade-off from one another because of the way they demand that resources, which are limited, be invested. And that was the trade-off he was primarily talking about. Well, are we always going to be stuck with that trade-off? Well, yes, but within certain limits. If we look at things a little bit more systemically and holistically, there are some effects that we can do when we organize people to get around some of these issues. So let's dig just a little bit deeper so we understand what this trade-off is, because at the end, the trade-off is going to be a really important choice we have to make as leaders. So again, here's a chart, the amount of resources shown from low to high to the left, and the number of people being helped or served here going along the horizontal axis at the bottom. And the first approach we kind of looked at, that linear approach, that's managing it. And that just says for every new block of cheese we want to hand out, for every car we want to provide, for every service we want to have, there's an increment amount of money that it costs. And so for every person more that we help, there's an incremental amount of resources we have to invest in a linear way. But that's the way we invest the resources. When it comes, as we know, to scale, the actually outcomes look like this. And this is a curve I think we all recognize, the beloved bell curve, which essentially says that these things tend to cluster in the middle. And why 80% of the people, for the most part, are being served by this model of resource kind of allocation through standardized ways, because of the sameness, because of the standardness, we also know that there's these tails of the curve that aren't being served very well. That's that 20% itself. So scale kind of shoots for the middle. It shoots for the middle around its standards. But again, it's a noble goal. You have to have it. It tends to manage programs, tends to be in hierarchies, and it's always trying to answer this question, are we doing things right? Efficiency. But if you think about resolution or problem solving, which is dealing with complexity, the curve looks completely different. And this is exactly what Malcolm Gladwell showed us. It's a different question. It's about effectiveness. Are we doing the right things, which is a different question than what scale's approaching at. And here, as you see under the curve, a very small number of people accumulate and use, and we have to invest all the resources in, like Murray Barr. And so this is, again, that logarithmic power law kind of curve. That's a reality for this particular kind of approach. So these two approaches are really kind of in a competitive conflict with each other in which a trade-off exists because of these resource constraints. And this has a profound effect of how we order and organize people. Now, there also might ask the question, all right, well, so where's dissolution, on this? Where's systems building work on this curve? Well, people continue to look at it and think, well, I'm not sure. And the answer is it's not on this. It's part of this curve, but it's in a completely different axis. It's on a qualitative axis. And so your actual kind of coordination or systems building dissolution work sits on this axis because it deals more about the quality of the fit. you know, the interactions, the relationships, back to Cassie saying we found out there aren't a lot of interactions actually going on, and that actually the system isn't designed to achieve the right ends, which is a different question. So the system design axis is a qualitative axis out to the left, and then the solve it part, the lead it part also has an important part play here, which is the systems leadership, which the academy is all about. It sets the purpose and tries to really, I would think, address that really ultimate question of how do we decide what is right? Because for the other pieces to have, they all have right in their question, but at the end of the day, some group has to kind of come together and decide what is the right set of values, or what's the trade-offs that we're going to decide. And we'll talk about those trade-offs at the very end. Remember, the first part, the little graph in the middle, is working inside the system. And because of that, it brings about those resource constraints. But the other part, the qualitative aspects of dissolution and system kind of work, is working on the system itself. And so it doesn't suffer from all the same restraints, but it can actually be complementary. So now we kind of find out that these little habitats, some of them are in competition and require trade-offs. Others are complementary to both. And that's going to have huge implications of how we organize people. If you have your handouts, we're starting on this time around the session on page 10. You'll see this actual chart itself, but I think it's a great reminder that when it comes to systems leadership, there are definitely trade-offs, but there's also qualitative things that help us balance those trade-offs, and we have to be working on both. And it has profound implications how we ultimately organize people to the best way we can. The lesson on that, structure always reflects this trade-off between scale and variation, or scale and complexity. And there's very little things we can do about that, because even though they're open systems, they're still restrained by resources. None of our organizations on the phone have an infinite supply of resources, and the flow of those resources is actually influenced by many things well beyond our control. So that's the first thing. We have to respect this trade-off. Now, are there ways of kind of balancing or managing this trade-off? Well, there are. The first time I ever heard the word systemness actually used in practice was actually in the healthcare industry. And it represented this movement among very large healthcare systems that were starting to question their very structure. In other words, should we have a massive hierarchy, run everyone that we can through the emergency department and triage everything? Is that the best way that we can possibly manage this system? Or are there better ways that we can organize ourselves? Because of that movement, a number of big hospital systems actually started to move to something that I think is interesting for our kind of case here today. And then they actually started making the distinction between complicated systems themselves, things that were trying to manage things efficiently and bring to scale, things that could be managed. But at the same time, there was another set of kind of subsystems that represented really complex kinds of things that had to be addressed here. It had to be individualized. It had to be customized. And so on the left, you find nurse practitioners, preventative care, prenatal, palliative, chronic disease management, things that you want to manage, should have checklists, should use resources efficiently on that area. But on the right is that structure where the problems become so complex. You need cross kind of departmental and cross-functional teams of doctors, acute care specialists, and specialists working together in teams to try to address very complex individual cases that the management side's just not going to be able to address. But then they realize, well, okay, you have two systems. It's hard enough managing one. How does that happen? Well, it takes an enlightened leadership to do in order to do that. Because if you think about it, these two circles represent two very profound worlds. And then what I mean by that is between the left and the right, I mean, that would require a different way of addressing the problem completely, managing or solving it, different decision-making that leadership would have to take in each of those circles, a different leadership approach, whether it's top-down coordinated or much more the management of kind of coordinated professional teams. The resource allocation process obviously has to be different. We've seen the curves before. And even the way we measure the outcomes, whether it's efficiency or effectiveness, would be different. So you're effectively running two different structures themselves. But if you kind of get the right idea around leadership itself, you can kind of see there's a way to pull these two things together as long as the leaders know the trade-offs they're making and the fact that they're actually managing two different systems that have to be delicately treated in two different ways, and allow that to be the case. And from what you know from our hierarchical industrial past, that's not always been the case. In fact, that's actually been the exception. But this is where a lot of this kind of systems leadership has been moving really over the last decade itself. It's trying to solve this or fulfill this dissolve function, trying to coordinate these two systems into one experience for patients, so they themselves don't have to navigate back and forth or get bounced back and forth between these two circles. So this is a very different model, but it also shows you how you can kind of transcend some of the effects of this trade-off between doing the kind of work that's required on the left and the kind of work that's required on the right. So in other words, we're trying to actually get over and transcend this Malcolm Gladwell. Well, you can do this or you can do that, but you can't do both. There's a lot of very interesting things out there showing if you're going to take a systems approach, you can do both. But it requires a different kind of enlightened leadership that realizes this is what they're doing and this is why they're doing it. Now, we can borrow heavily from the healthcare industry and other industries that began to adopt this from this kind of premise of, you have to basically give each structure one thing to do, because it can only make decisions accordingly to the resources it has. And once the resources are invested, they're gone. And so each of these structures has their different kind of resource constraints and the way they invest it. So you can't ask one structure to do two different things because the resources are gone. That's called the resource constraint problem that we know very, very well about. But what the healthcare example we just saw showed us is you can always build a more expansive system that kind of takes that in from a more coherent, larger scale thing that encompasses more than one structure. I mean, at the end of the day, that is systems. That's really what we're trying to get toward. Allowing each of these different systems to maintain their integrity, to do what they're supposed to be doing in the way they're supposed to be doing it, but then integrating that into something bigger. And that's what the kind of the systems leadership, I think, really school is really all about. So within each context, people need to be organized according to the problem that they're addressing and the appropriate response required. Those were the first two sessions. But now let's talk about what that might actually kind of look like if you did it with the organization of people in mind. So here's an example. And the only reason I can provide it as an example is because there's no one right way to do this whatsoever. So all we can do is provide examples of how it's been done. But here's so here's what this might look like if we just started to build it out. I'm going to give it to you kind of high level, and then I'm going to give you an example. And then we're actually going to look at a further example later on, which makes a completely radically different shift in the choices that they actually make. And hopefully in those comparisons and contrasts, we kind of see the different decisions that you and I have to start considering. So here, if you think about it, and the key page here in your handouts will be on page 12. I think you'll be able to see this a little bit more better. And maybe even more, I think, in depth, you might want to flip to page 20 at this particular point, and then we'll come back to page 12. But see if you can look at page 20. It should look very eerily similar to what's being built out on your screen. So here's an example of a team structure. I've made up all these names. They're as generic as I could potentially make them. The names aren't important, but they should have a name. And I also very worry that most of your systems are already structured in some way. So we have to be careful about the way we talk about organizing, because we're never usually starting from a blank piece of paper usually. There already is a structure there, and so we want to be very mindful of that as well. So this is an example. It's not a prescription. It's an example for kind of the purposes of how this might look if you rolled it out. So on top, as you might imagine, it's all about large scale, bringing things, right, repetitive service over and over again. And you might call that a service team. Right. This is probably what they really mean by collective impact, the way most people use it. It's most of the big providers that are providing the most things to the most people brought together in a room to see if they can improve the efficiency, the way they use resources, and get that alignment of that kind of resource expenditure and investment more in line with one another. And they may have a common agenda about how they want to do that, but to be clear, it's all focused on efficiency. And it's really trying to ensure that the necessary resources exist and they're invested in an efficient manner to get the most things to the most people. That'd be a service team. These 10 would probably, let's face it, they represent the biggest hierarchies in terms of hierarchical organizations in the system. So that's the important part to keep in mind. These people already work somewhere else in a different structure. So be very, very clear. We're talking about a system structure, how they would come together to organize themselves systemically. So each of these people here would represent or probably work for probably an organization that has a pretty decent top-down actually kind of structure themselves for resource allocations, what they tend to look like. But in this case, we're going to bring them together so they can really work on the resources at the system level rather than just the organization level. I mean, that's probably what a service team is. It'd probably be the largest team in most systems. There's going to be an exception coming up, but it's probably the largest team. Wouldn't be unusual if it was 15, 20, upwards of 30 kind of stakeholders around the table because they represent the majority of the system's work. So that's one example. Down to the left, you might expect there's a different kind of team structure that you have, because here we're talking about experts solving individual complex problems. So here, I'm just going to call this a solution team. And you can have any number of solution teams, especially if a system's big and you kind of have to scale it. But this would be more of a cross-functional group of experts and specialists that come together pretty frequently. And they begin to look at kind of different problems where scale's not working up above. And these people, therefore, that come into the system with problems that they're looking to kind of address. So this would try to solve these problems individual by individual on a case management, a lot of times, basis. And then they're trying to take what they learn and see if they can't use that to ultimately fix and kind of dissolve the system. Which is why they need the third leg of the triangle, the dissolve it piece. Someone has to kind of be there then to take these problems that they're discovering and actually begin to shape and redesign the system itself. So we might call this little team to the right a design team. It's probably going to be the smallest of all teams relatively in scope in comparison to the other two kinds of teams, but they're the ones who really wouldn't exist if the other kind of two circles didn't exist at all. But they're taking what the other groups are learning about scale and complexity and variation, and they're actually trying to redesign the system by improving the way all of it kind of works together, so it creates a holistic experience to whoever the system is actually serving. So these tend to be small teams. They tend to be working on things such as policy, as we heard earlier, but just as importantly, pilots and probes and experiments. And they're trying to do system design, they're trying to coordinate various activities. They're the ones ultimately working on the system itself and just not merely in it. They're a true service team in the fact that they actually serve the other two teams whose work wouldn't exist. The design team's work wouldn't exist if the other two teams weren't there, but they know where all the problems are. It's the design team's task to take those problems, begin to work on dissolving those problems by better coordinating the system into a whole. Then something we will get to, and that's what really the next 7 sessions are really about, is, well, so then what is the function of leadership? We addressed it quickly here today in our hospital example, but there needs to be a leadership team. And one example of this would be ideally that the leadership team is simply composed of the key conveners or members of the other teams themselves. And that's really how the system coheres. It shares interactions among itself. It communicates the continuous communication piece that you always hear so much about, collective impact. But this is how that kind of might unfold. So this is an example, right, of how it might look or how it might kind of look from a very kind of theoretical framework, just trying to be all-encompassing of all different kinds of problems. So let's look at a specific example of what that kind of looks like. And I think that this slide kind of lays out the idea of do not forget what we're trying to achieve in each of these areas. The reason why we're trying to organize these teams differently is because each is trying to have a different goal and a different type of thing it does for the service of the whole. Scale, up above, complexity, coordination, and leadership. And to get to systemness, right, we have to have a nice balance of all of that. The two to the top and the left, manage it and solve it, are working in the system, remember? I know we keep hitting this a lot, but it's an important distinction. And then the two kind of circles over to the right, the dissolve it, the design team and the leadership team, they're the ones that are trying to work on the system itself. Those are the key distinctions, again, between the ways you're trying to organize people and what those people are working on. So as I said, there's an overview on page 20 of that, but there's also a rabbit hole opportunity. So in your Dropbox, there's also a set of sheets that aren't included in your handouts that really allow you to take this example and go much deeper. For those of you interested, there's a way of kind of saying, well, a management team kind of looks like this. And there's a set for each of these circles that kind of looks like this. We thought these were a good example of team charters, because a lot of you always ask about, these teams aren't really sure what they're doing or what their role is in something bigger. And this helps to tie that big ecosystem picture back to the actual team level itself. And that it really addresses, why are we here? What's the name? What's the description? What's the goal? What key question are we trying to address? What's our work? What are our key tasks, the structure, the interactions, the measures, and so forth? And there's one for each of those circles. And so that doesn't matter, no matter what team you're on within this larger kind of ecosystem organization, you really understand not only what your team's responsibility is, but what it is in the larger context of the other teams as well. Now, actually, in your handouts themselves, there's some high-level overviews starting on 20, and then going on, if you just keep flipping the pages, it's the same thing I just showed you, but it's distributed out on the circles themselves. So it says the noble goal, and it'll tell you that for each of the circles. There's also what the work looks like and how it's different, how the team might be structured, and how that structure probably is going to be different, how the other teams need to interact with one another, and even the metrics and the measures that might be considered based on the type of problem they're looking at. So there's a deep, dark rabbit hole for any of you interested, not only in the handouts, but also in the Dropbox at the root level. There's a whole series of kind of deep dives on what team charters could look like for that particular example. Now let's look at a real world example. This one will look familiar to Jim Roberts on this, but this is Counseling Counts, which was an approach really put together a number of years ago in our local school corporation to build a true community-based school kind of counseling model, which means we'd have just as much engagement from the community itself than inside the school to try to address mental health issues for that. So the inside the circle represents that gray circle where it says school. The whole thing is focused around an intrinsic relationship of the student-counselor relationship, which we'll talk about when we get to practices, how to kind of view it that way. And then outside the circle are more community-based stakeholders themselves, support organizations, and so forth. So again, we know we have to have a management function. Those serving, right, the most number of kids for the mental health services, and most communities, as of yours, you have those providers, you have those mental health services. So this is precisely where they go and what their role is. Now, this particular project was writing a pretty big grant in which they were actually trying to also put in place some pilot projects in which they were actually trying to increase the efficiency of resources and getting the scale higher, because we had a tremendous backlog and backlist of students that needed services. So we were trying to see anything we could do to get counselor time usage higher. And so a lot of those projects were actually added into that service because, again, it was all about efficiency and greater scale or capacity. Similar to, was it Cassie, or was it someone who identified that they need to be greater training for therapists on the area? Yes. Okay. So very similar to that. And this particular example, by the way, is on page 13. If you flip that, I think it'll be easier to see on the eyes. But then, we said we also need to have this component, right, that's going to help solve things. And we're going to structure that very differently. Here, we knew we needed some community support services that would solve kind of problems across the whole system level. And some of these were new systems that we put into helpline, dedicated helplines to United Way, certain coaching programs, building capacity within those and so forth. But there was also this addition of kind of these care teams, which kind of set building by building by building, these new ways to triage immediate problems and having one kind of identified coordinator for each of those teams in place across the system itself. So this was a brand new kind of structure that we kind of had to bring together and appropriately place it at kind of the building level to kind of make the solve it function happen. And at that time, true to some of you said, there was no dissolution or there was no kind of systems leadership function trying to bring these two things together for students. They tended to find themselves in one place or the other, sometimes being ping-ponged back and forth. So the school and the community together put in place kind of a cross-functional leadership team between the school and the community that would serve as the guiding team to hold this whole initiative actually together. Then, with some grant funding that they sought and brought out, they actually then hired several coordinators that would really do the day-to-day work of working on the system, knowing that the other two circles were working merely in it. I shouldn't say merely, but also in it. That this group was really tasked with a different kind of role, to see if you can get this thing to work from a systemic standpoint as a seamless experience for students and counselors across both inside the school and outside the school. The last component was important because they decided they wanted to move from a deficit-based approach to an asset-based approach for student development. So this became the whole operating language and even the way of assessing progress for the whole system itself. So this was a really important part of the system's coordination and leadership function. Again, that was all new. So pretty much this whole circle to the right, bottom, had to be kind of built and stood up so it could support the two functions that were kind of going on in the manage it and solve it space. But you notice we had to add some stuff even there to kind of glue them together. And that's what we're going to be looking at today kind of in our practice assignment. So that's kind of an counseling accounts example. The other thing that's really, I think that we point out on this a lot of times, that equity implications on this. Many of you have seen these United Way kind of graphics that came out a number of years ago to try to explain the difference between kind of equality and equity. And if you think about it, we always kind of think this management function kind of feels like this, right? Getting more things to more people to do most good. Everyone gets the same thing because everything's standardized, that scale. It works for some, works for most, doesn't work for all. And so the solve it function tries to come in and rearrange the boxes a bit, trying to find out, customized, individualized solutions to make the resources that are there reconfigured. Notice again, there's those curves. One curve, just a linear curve. The other curve is a power law curve. There it is. I mean, show it in picture form right there. That's that trade-off that kind of always exists between those two systems. But of course, the systems thinkers weren't happy with either one of these pictures and said there's a missing picture. Of course, redesigning the system itself, just redesign. Keep the functionality of the fence, but design it for the safety of all. Get rid of the supports and accommodations so we don't have to manage it or solve it. Finished. Okay, so that's, I think, a kind of a metaphoric way of also understanding the trade-offs of these two pieces that we covered with kind of, let's face it, abstract graphs. I think this is a way that kind of ties it back to imagery, but still points out these very, very difficult trade-offs that system leaders have to make. So I want to just finish this section and finalize with kind of a look at, can you make other decisions about these trade-offs? Well, you can. But let me just really quickly cover this about how do most collaboratives kind of organize themselves. I'm always fascinated in this when they tell me what problem they're working on. And I always say, well, how did you organize yourself? It's a struggle for many collaboratives and different kinds of coalitions and collective impact initiatives to tell me. A lot of times they say, hey, they just kind of went with the old-fashioned, Chamber of Commerce model. Get yourself a chair, a co-chair, person, get some working teams around that, small board of directors, see what you can do. And that's a good response if you're working on kind of a simple or a complicated problem. And this comes from the metaphor really of how organizations have been structured for many thousands of years, and that you have someone who's the head of the organization, and then they're there to actually do all the thinking for the body that's kind of underneath it. And that's exactly why you say, well, who's the head of that organization? And ironically, body in Latin means corpus, which means corporation or Army Corps or what. That's the root of the word. So most of our hierarchies are really built upon this head body model. And that's where all the terminology kind of comes from, the head of the corporation. And as you know, then they take the problem and they divide it into different divisions, departments, to actually get down to functions and pieces like that. And again, if you're managing a problem and the problem is clear and cause and effect is known, you can do this all day long and it works pretty well. It actually does a nice job. But where doesn't it work? Well, it assumes that the problem can be managed and measured. And if a problem can't be managed or measured, there's a lot of problems this hierarchy is going to kind of run into, because it's put in place, right, the wrong organizational structure based on the problem that it's actually trying to address. It's there for the efficient allocation of standardized resources for the large part. And this is how you divide it up, like an assembly line, to make that happen. So this is a very traditional way, you see, just go with the standard hierarchy and get a group put together, divide it into teams. And that works as long, again, as you can manage it and measure it. And if you can't, then there needs to be, I think, a discussion. You know, the other common way you see around organizations, take your problem, let's say mental health, as we have as one of our systems here, and then let's just kind of divide it into a series of sub-problems. You know, access, provider pipeline, program and service alignment, need gaps there, basic needs that we may have to address above and beyond mental health, and then knowledge, perception, stigma, all of that basic work. And this is good, but you notice it's based around the content of problems and not the structure of problems. So as the problems change, the structure has to change. And many structures don't. They're not very organic. People like to have stability in structure. And so many times over a period of time, you find out that your structure gets out of alignment with actually the problem and the basis of the work that the group is working on. So you can do this and kind of get away with it as long as you're willing just to keep changing it very fluid light, and keep taking these out, adding new programs, and just keep manipulating this. But to lock it in and think that that's going to be your structure for a long term just can't happen, because the problems keep changing as you work on them and interact with them. So here they're abstracting problems from reality based on really what they're about and not how they're structured. So you still have the structure problem that comes about. And then some of you have the greatness of having a system that actually has some structure to it, like education, which is great. So this, you tend to see cradle to career types of initiatives where it's prenatal, birth to pre-K, post, you got K through 12, post-secondary, all the way through career. Nice, because the system is kind of structured that way. And that's a nice way to kind of put things in place. I think the two things you have to be careful is you're kind of siloing the work, as many of you know do this work, where some of the key kind of interactions have to go between the transition between those stages. But also, it doesn't eliminate the need of still addressing clear, complicated, complex, and chaotic problems in each one of those, which are going to happen. So it addresses the what, but it doesn't necessarily address the structure of problems. And when you don't think about the structure of problems, you're always going to run the risk of having your response and the way you organize people be out of alignment. So you just have to kind of be careful. So I'd be interested if you think about other traditional ways you see the way collaboratives doing this kind of work organize themselves. These were just a few I frequently see. And it's always interesting to me to see how they kind of came up with those and kind of said, how is this in alignment with not only the problem they're trying to work on, but how they're approaching it, and then how they put the people together to bring that all to life. That's ultimately what we're trying to get at here with this kind of three-part structure. So to summarize and to finalize this third part of organizing people, just a quick review. Right? On problem structure, here we're trying to untangle and organize these different contexts based on the nature of the relationship between cause and effect. We're trying to get different problems in these different little habitats or contexts. So we'll be sorted not by what they're about, but how they're structured. And then the next question you and I have to address as kind of a leader and with our group is, each of the contexts demand a different approach. Each of these kind of contexts prefer a different kind of response. So we have to be careful that the way we're responding is in alignment with the context in which we're actually trying to serve itself. When you take problems based on their content and you put them in a context based on their structure, it changes their meaning, the way you actually look at problems. Because anytime you take something and put in a new context, you shape and influence its meaning. So by putting these in different contexts, it does change the meaning, and it changes the way we might think about how we might respond and approach the problem. And then finally, in organizing people, you can learn to take different structures, let them be true to themselves, and then integrate it into something larger. But it takes an enlightened set of leadership to make that happen, to know that these different systems have to be managed, led, resourced, and measured in different ways. And that's okay. It's exactly the way it's supposed to be. But you have to really kind of let go of this command and control approach and really think about it in a different approach from leadership to make that structure work. So there is actually the final kind of conclusion, I think, wrap up that in your handout materials on page 17. And we'll kind of just do the final reminder, and then I'm going to share one concluding case, which is a case we're going to use throughout the practice thing. So it's a great transition from going from organizing people to moving into the practices themselves. But what have we learned over the 3? Well, there's these 4 activities of work that are crucial in any complex system. And each of these is based upon a different kind of system design principle of how we're kind of thinking about building the system out. For management, obviously, you're designing for scale, must have it. Right? For solving it, you're designing for variation when scale doesn't work. And finally, for dissolving it, someone has to worry about systemness, the coordination of those 2 things together to provide a seamless experience for those who the system serves. Each of those is based upon a noble goal, right? We don't need to cover these again, but the most, the right, and the whole. And each of those goals indeed is extraordinarily important that they're aligned around those goals, and that's what they're doing. And again, each of those provides a very noble aspiration of how the system needs to be built. All right, all need to be included and integrated. Then you've got the 3 pieces, the program structure, our approach, and the way we organize people. And if you recall, right, manage it about clear kinds of problems, solve it is about complicated, and dissolving it is always about complex, where we have to probe because the causality is unknown, intertwined, circular, reflexive, and so forth. So knowing the problem that we want to face is really important, and then getting how we're going to approach it to be in alignment with that hierarchy of effectiveness, whether they're going to resolve it, solve it, or dissolve it in alignment. And then finally, how we kind of organize ourselves, how we organize our people has to be in complete alignment with that goal, with the structure of the problem that they're there to actually address, and the way they actually chose to respond to it. That tells you everything about kind of what the team needs to be working on. And I put some words down there as the chief characteristics I think are inherently important. Now, what's leadership's role? It's the column to the left. It's there to make sure those things are defined, and it's there to make sure those things are in alignment itself. So it plays a hugely important role. It's just kind of working at this meta level over to the left to make sure that these things happen. And if you think about it, that kind of gives each team now its marching orders about what it's there to do, what it contributes back to the system, and how it really needs to structure and organize itself to make the most amount of systemness. So that brings together the first 3 about the approach. And I want to end this by looking at a case very quickly, because it brings together everything we've talked about thus far, but also sets the stage for the practices. I don't know if you've really been watching the news over in Europe. Before COVID hit, Europe had, I think, one of the biggest crises when it came to its healthcare because of nurses going on strike. They felt that people were not being treated, and talking about patients, well. They knew they, as nurses, were being overworked and underpaid. They had very little, because of government mandates about how actual wages would be distributed, very little power in order to change the system. And you frequently saw signs that say, applause is nice, but they don't pay my bills. And so there were millions and millions and millions of nurses that went on strike before COVID. After COVID, it got worse, as you might imagine. And all across Europe, these turned into monster rallies, closing down, in some cases, healthcare systems, bitter fights politically, them accusing the caregivers of actually putting people's lives at harm. It was a kind of terrible place to work, under terrible experiences, and they all felt, at the end of the day, we're not even doing the right thing for patients. Out of that came 3 people who quit. They just couldn't take it anymore. It just wasn't a conducive, too much stress, not enough pay. And at the end of the day, the patients weren't being taken care of. And these 3 individuals who quit together decided they'd have a pint, at the bar one night. And they decided to say, if you could have just done this all over again, if we could just redesign the system from square one, what would we do? What would we do differently? Should we be complaining about the current system if we can't address what we think we might change? And the three of them had a tremendous, of course, cocktail napkin kind of, epiphany about what they thought they would do to revolutionize healthcare. And this was in the Netherlands that this actually took place. The gentleman that's still there and ultimately became the director, Joost de Blok, was the one who actually kind of took responsibility to see if they could bring this small pilot idea to fruition. But it was a very different idea. The idea was called Buurtzorg, which means neighborhood care. And the fact that people, after they had their hospital experience, instead of going to a rehabilitation home where the services were expensive and they weren't up to the care standards that most nurses thought were appropriate, they were going to see if they could really figure out a home care model, putting the problem back into the context of people's homes and in their neighborhoods themselves. Now, in order to do that, that was going to require a radical rethink about how you were going to deliver healthcare services. But I think they might have done it. If you look at the performance of Buurtzorg against all other healthcare organizations in the Netherlands and now beyond and even into Asia and Japan, they have a 30% higher client satisfaction rate than usual healthcare providers. Staff absenteeism among their nurses is down less than 33%, less than the industry average. Staff turnover, 50% less than the industry average. Overhead costs, now you're going to say, wow, this was by design because of that trade-off I told you about. Overhead costs were almost 70% lower than all other healthcare organizations. One study I said if all healthcare was provided by Buurtzorg using this approach, that the Netherlands would save almost $2 billion a year just on out-of-hospital care alone by hitting with the model. So what's the model? It's radical in the fact that Joost de Blok decided not to be a leader in the typical sense, but to empower to the highest degree individual nurses and the relationship they have with their patients themselves. A direct model, and everything would be built around that. So it wasn't actually trying to go scale as the actual kind of design solution, but actually solution itself would become the scale element, which seems a little bit paradoxical. But somehow these self-organizing networks, these nurses serve now more 80,000 patients every single year. They spend 2 months less in care time because of the model's approach of helping people where they live and where they're actually living. And it has a 1/3 reduction in hospital admissions. And if they are admitted, they spend less time in the hospital than the whole system itself. So how is that result brought about? Well, it starts with this kind of onion model. They start fairly with kind of the idea of the self-managing client. It's our objective to get the client back on their feet, living the life that they want to live as quickly as possible. But they need to accept that responsibility first and foremost. And the second thing, they don't start with doctors, nurses, or even the medical system. They start with the informal networks of relationships, friends and family in the household, neighbors, social groups, other interactions they have, and they map that network of informal relationships together and see if they can begin to start put together a plan. Like, Nan's having, a pretty, significant recuperation period right now. Would you mind checking in on Nan on, evenings when you get home just by knocking on the door? Would that be okay? Type of discussions. And they build this really robust social network around using the informal networks that the clients themselves pretty much already have in place. Then the next thing is the Buurtzorg team. Nurses are actually structured in teams of 12. And that 12 serves a neighborhood of a number of cases. When a team gets bigger than 12, it divides. And when those teams grow, when they get to be 12, they divide as well. So the structure never gets bigger than 12 itself. They're self-managed teams completely. All decision-making relies with the team. Not some corporate structure, not some, home office. Everything decision-wise lies actually at the team level within the model. And then and only then do they engage the formal teams, the actual network of care providers, hospitals, specialists, and other appointments that have to kind of be made. So they turned everything kind of inside out about how care is delivered. And then they work in the neighborhoods, getting to know the resources, building relationships, serving clients in their homes, in their built environment, in their context, being able to kind of weave together resources most doctors wouldn't be able to weave together. As we said, they serve in teams of 12. As soon as they hit that team of 12, they kind of subdivide again. But every few days, they have this kind of case management all hands meeting in which they work through cases themselves, they advise each other, they make decisions together. But beyond just care time, which they're required to spend 60% of their time on patient care itself. But that other percent of the time, what are they doing? Well, they're doing a lot. They're planning and organizing their organization. They're recruiting new nurses. They're hiring, they're firing, they're compensating. They're doing, planning for professional development and staff training. And all that happens at these small kind of network, 12 kind of person groups and networks. They expand out from neighborhood by neighborhood, continuing to split these. Today, there are over 1,000 teams throughout Netherlands and Europe that provide the care. And who supports them? 50 people. 50 people support close to 10,000 individual nurses and 1,000 teams themselves. Again, a decision of the trade-off that Joost de Blok felt had to be made, and it had to be made intentionally. They have a small team, kind of a management core team themselves. They have no names, no titles, and there are no managers. That team has a series of coaches that they provide to the nursing things. These are for areas about self-management for the team and also nursing care. Those coaches can only advise. They can't make any decisions on behalf of the client or on behalf of the nurse themselves. The nurse and the client must make the decision together. The coaches is there to support the learning and the decision-making process itself. There's also a small team called the development team who takes all of the ideas that are generated to improve the overall structure and is really there to make that a reality. Should sound familiar. It's the dissolution team. They work on the Buurtzorg system and its network of protocols over time and continuous improvement. They do all basically kind of training on self-management. So they're actually training teams how to self-manage themselves and providing them the skills to do that. And the last thing they provide is an IT and financial structure. They handle all back-end pieces from finance and billing for all the teams. And then they provide something called Buurtzorg Web, which is basically a performance mechanism system to see how the team's doing on its basic metrics. And it can actually compare their results against other teams as well, anonymously, but at least in a peer fashion to see kind of where they stand on particular metrics. So if you think about this themselves, they have made a decision. Scale isn't going to be what they're trying to get at through the traditional kind of large-scale, efficient, make one thing, standardize it, just the opposite. They're going to keep the scale component of standardness down to the small, barest minimum that can possibly do it. They're using the onion model and coaches and the web, and that's all the home office. And they always put it in quote, the home office actually provides to the area. Instead, they actually prioritize the solve it circle to the largest extent to see if they could get scale there. And how are they getting scale? 12-person teams that self-organize, self-manage, divide over time, delivered in kind of the neighborhoods on the area. So a radical decision about this trade-off that's there. And then they have some dissolve it stuff, right? They do self-management training that they provided by the home office. And they actually have the development team that takes everything that's given to them through Buurtzorg Web. They take those, they prioritize them, and they work on systems projects to improve the system. Now, one thing about the approach, oh, sorry, forgot to say, there's a service team of 50 people, but think about that. 50 people run that entire kind of organization, or at least support it would be a better word, of nearly 1,000 self-managed teams, over 11,000 nurses, and 80,000 patients. That's the smallest number of support staff in almost all of Europe in terms of an administrative team relative to the number of employees and customers that you'll actually find. There is a short story about this, and I included on here. It's 4 minutes of your time, but if you really want to get an overview and a little bit deeper dive, I've included this kind of 4-minute overview that I think talks about the model, how it works. But what I want to really cover is this last part about when we chose this model, the ecosystem model. I still think it's the right model, but anytime you pick a metaphor and you pick a model, there's going to be limitations. And I want to point out that kind of limitation now, just so I can get you thinking visually in a different way about this model. So you remember there's our duties that have to be taken care of: management, solve it, dissolve it, and lead it. And the problem with this approach is it makes it all look equal. because it shows them as equal kind of sizes at all. But this isn't kind of true to, I guess, the trade-off I talked about here today between scale and complexity. So I need to correct that just a little bit, so our thinking is a little more visual. So all I did in that animation really is I just took that and I brought it into one way you could make the decision about scale and complexity, and that's prioritize scale. I think most systems do this. I think 80% of our systems, that's where they probably are. It kind of looks like this in terms of the bubble. I don't know what percent actually deliberately thought scale should be the priority. My guess is maybe half. And how many of those just implicitly started with scale because it seemed like the right thing to do and they had their problem versus their approach out of alignment? But nonetheless, a lot of our problems today are because systems look like this. Scale has been given all the resources and all the priorities, and therefore we can only really help at the end of the day that most people manage symptoms. Then, because of that, the manage part, as we know, is all based on standards. And the problem with solve it in such a system is, since we gave all the resources to the top bubble, is the best they can kind of do is they can't scale. They have to just help people one-on-one. And it's a thing that can't be scaled because it has to be so complex and it has to be so customized. So it limits what the solving option can do. So here you bring in a solve it function basically just as band-aids, right, for what scale can't help. Navigators, tech support, triage teams, care response, help desks, connectors, so forth and so on. And that's the decision that kind of has to be made because of this trade-off. A lot of times delete it, dissolve it, since they're not thinking systemically, not even thought of, right? Because they're only working in the system. They don't think they can also work on the system. And so I would say a lot of systems today, this is how they look at. So if you looked at your ecosystem framework back again, they probably look something like this. Now, what we saw with Buurtzorg and Joost de Blok is he made deliberately a very specific decision about this trade-off between scale and complexity. And he decided to go with complexity as the thing, but do it in the most simple way possible by keeping every administrative part almost non-existent. So his way of thinking would look something more like this. Right, let's see what we can do to put a support mechanism, very small, that would support these individual teams working directly with clients. And let's put that as the lead priority. That's how we're going to manage this trade-off. We're going to put most of the resources in the solve it, the least amount we can to manage it. Now you know why they had the lowest overhead costs of any healthcare organization out there, because of this deliberate decision. So here there's a trade-off again. There always is a trade-off, and that was our whole point. So what's the trade-off here? Well, it's a pretty important one. So if complexity or solving is chosen as the priority of the system, the scaling of it has to happen a completely different way than if you're managing it, which is you're just giving the same thing to all people with sameness and customization and standards. Here, it requires a different choice made by the actual leadership itself in the system. And what is that thing that they have to trade off? Well, they have to actually give up, and it's exactly what Joost de Blok did, command and control, hierarchical structures, leadership, managers, centralized decision-making, top-down resource allocation and planning, and instead shift to a model that builds freedom, trust, and autonomy among those self-organized teams. That's the trade-off that would have to be made. So the model, I think, still works to a large extent, the ecosystem work, but I didn't want us to fall into the false or complacent attitude that somehow that all three of these are balanced or all three need to be there with equal weight and measure. They can't be. But deliberate decisions made in such a way not only can kind of solve, no pun intended here, some of our harshest problems, but can also transcend to some extent these trade-offs, as we as system leaders are willing to make some different kinds of decisions about how the system will actually be built out and how it will be led. But as you notice, there's always trade-offs. The tragedy is when we don't think about the trade-offs and we let them happen naturally, as opposed to explicitly making them, as Joost de Blok did with Buurtzorg. But look at the pure innovation power you can have by making a different decision than the way other systems actually make that same decision. So we're going to keep coming back to Buurtzorg because they do so many things right. And so when we get to practices, we're going to continually come back and say, remember how Buurtzorg does this. There is actually also in your Dropbox folder a folder that says Buurtzorg. And for those of you who are saying, oh, I need the data to see if there's tons of studies, there's tons of analysis that have been done. There's some fun stories if you just want to read something lighter or high about how it works and what they're able to achieve. But if you're interested in digging deeper, there is that folder available. The bottom line, at the end of the day, we have to get to structures and the way we organize people that treat symptoms, but also treat causes. And what we're advocating with systems is we need to also eliminate causes rather than solving the same problems over and over and being proud of that. But at the end of the day, leadership, which is what we're going into at next session, you have to choose and make your trade-offs and know what those trade-offs are that actually exist, because it's the key thing in decision-making of how we organize people many times. And it's always there, it's always present, whether we choose to engage with the thought or not. So there we go. So now we've gotten our habitats, we've gotten the kinds of problems put in a proper home. We've kind of got the approaches lined up, the way that's going to best respond to each of these problems. And now we've given a little bit thought about the complexity of structure. We're not looking for one structure or one thing. We're looking for something that's, more like an ecosystem itself. A number of structures, each that have integrity to themselves, but you're integrating into something larger, but allowing everything to have its way in what it needs to do and affecting how we organize people. In other words, we need to organize different problems differently with different people. And giving that thought is precisely what we want to do for the homework assignment. So to kind of think about that, what did we talk about today? Well, instead of organizing around what a problem is about, it's possible to organize around how a problem is structured. And that helps us in the future because we don't know what problems are going to come in terms of their content in the future, but we can have some insights thanks to complexity science about how those problems will actually be structured. And so it is possible to not only address some of these trade-offs, but to transcend them in certain ways, to build an organization that actually learns how to address any problem that we may encounter in the future if we're willing to get those three things into alignment. I leave you with this picture, so it's all about ecosystems, but I want you to think of structure this way, not of our org charts or these top-down things or even circles for that matter, but structure is something in which you have a lot of different kinds of structures in a system, each kind of doing their thing, but also each balancing and contributing to the other things. It changes over time, and when things get out of balance, it can completely destroy, right, the ecosystem itself in terms of its habitat. And I think that there's a nice way of thinking about this. If you think about the word structure, its Latin root used to mean, and still does, to build, to grow, to evolve. Right? It was always a verb. Share was always thought of as a verb. Unfortunately, today, we tend to think of the word structure as a noun. What's your structure as a thing or an object? I think it behooves all of us and use this language of system is try to always use the word organizing as we've done here today, because I think you always need to retrain that verb form, because ideally your structure is always going to have to change, really, no matter how or what method or approach you choose to organize people. So it's an evolving thing, not a one-time static infrastructure. Think coral reef, all right, instead of hierarchy. The practice assignment this time builds around what you did last time. Most of you will probably have a lot of the raw material you need already to actually complete this. We're going to use the posters that were sent, and if you didn't get your posters, please let us know so we can make sure we get those, but you should have your posters, and one of those should be your social ecosystem map. So we would like you to play around a little bit with this monster of a poster. Good luck finding the spot for it. It's about 6 feet long if you haven't seen it. And grab yourself some Post-it notes and seeing if we can now start bringing these three things into alignment around the area. So some thoughts about how we can kind of do this. What's the practice assignment? So thought number one, we kind of need to think, how could we organize the stakeholders that you kind of identified around managing problems, right? And who might compose that team? Now you've kind of done that. It's a good start. Also solving problems and who might compose that team. And then, also dissolving problems and who might compose that team itself. Be on the lookout, also for, is anyone leading the system currently? Who might that be? They're trying to bring those three other activities into a harmonious whole. and try to see if you can't try to think who might compose. Notice this is always about how could you and how might you. It's to generate this habit of mind to start thinking about where that system kind of really is. Most of you've already identified these. It's just a matter of thinking about who needs to kind of compose the teams. Then, you might think about how might that team be structured? Is it a hierarchy? Is it a small working group? What's the structure that we would organize those people into? And also, what interactions might the team have with other teams? I think that's a deeper dive question that I would kind of hold. It's somewhat addressed in your handout materials for those who want to kind of take a bit of a deeper look, but I think that that's a key question for here. So this you've kind of already started. We're just asking to begin to apply that to the poster itself. And then the second part of the task just complements and completes the first one, considering how that system, could be organized itself. Think about a little bit about the same we had in the end. How might this scale and complexity trade-off be addressed? This requires a deliberate decision to be made among two competing alternatives, but this choice can also be a major significant source of innovation, as we saw in the Birdsword case. So this is thinking about, I'm missing a period, apologize. This case is also thinking about a little bit about that scale versus complexity, not just going with 3 equal structures, but thinking about it purposefully and deliberately, how we're going to try to think about that trade-off that we all have to make. It's always going to be there. As a result of that decision, what response B would be required of the system's leadership? That's kind of a tricky one of what I've kind of given you some of the thoughts, but there's a lot more thoughts there I haven't really covered in terms of the full implications of what if you chose scale, what if you chose complexity as where we're going to put a majority of the resources. What are the implications for systems leadership? They're big and they're profound. It may be the whole art right there in one question. And then always ask you, what's missing? In some cases, it may be a whole circle, like we talked about in the counseling, or some of you already identified in your kind of excellent write-ups today. So I think that's another part of the consideration. There's no right or wrong here. The rest of these are more just kind of like, all right, if you need some instructions or need some help. This is a global framework, this ecosystem one. All your other posters talk to that one or represented within that. This is the one that holds all the work together that you would want to show all stakeholders all the time as much as you can, just to remind them that they play an important role in something much bigger than themselves. So I think that's an important distinction between this and the other posters. Now, I think you can practice using reviewing 2 examples that I've given you forward. So get some Post-it notes. And the first thing I'm going to try to do is create kind of a legend for those different color Post-it notes. So you're going to organize these by color themselves. Don't forget, you've already identified many of these stakeholders already. Now, for those like Kelly and Joy and things like that, we want you also to try to take it down to individual people if you can. This is not a public map. This is a map for you talking about relationships. If you can get it down to a role or to a particular person that would make the right organization, go down to that level if you can actually do it. So these kind of instructions here, I think just kind of say there's 2 ways you could just develop this as a pure stakeholder map, putting people and organizations, that are primarily managing, solving, and dissolving things. A lot of you have already done that. For those times when you get a big organization and you don't know where they go, they're too big, break it apart. Break it down to its departments or its programs or its services with the name and organize them that way. So if you get stuck, it's because it's too big. Break it up. See if you can continue to unpack it until you can get them to kind of slide in to where each of those purposes fit best. But you could also create a hybrid map. It doesn't have to be just stakeholders. You could actually put programs or projects or support services or groups that are really important, the things that are the glue that hold things together. You could so do that as well. Once you get your poster done, snap a picture of it, send it to us. That's kind of the name. So play around with your poster, follow the directions. 2 examples I've given you. Here's the primary basic stakeholder map itself. And the key to all these is trying to get the right side of this map kind of laid out. That's where I would start. Just kind of give each color a different kind of label. So here we might just say, okay, what teams or what stakeholders might we actually kind of need in each of these areas? And then we might come in with another one and say, hey, what's the role of each of these teams? You know, what do we think they need to be doing? What's their work? In other words, how are we going to kind of organize or structure them? So this is kind of strictly around this. But then we can add, you know, if you want a different color, you know, feel free to order key projects, support services, or practices that, you know, are really important, like self-managed teams is a practice for Bertsorg that was extraordinarily important onto the map. And, you know, you probably end up with something like this. It's a combination, you know, of system components and important things that kind of, you know, that kind of make up the system itself. It's simple, but it kind of tells you how the model kind of unfolds. Or you could go to the counseling counts model, which we looked, and do something very similar. This one, I said, you know, lay in your existing stakeholders. Many of you have already done that, easy. You also say there's some people missing. There are some people that we would need within each of these to be there. Give it another color. Right? These are additional stakeholders that should be considered that maybe aren't kind of at the table today that we'd like to bring to the table. Keep going if you have more. If you want to put in some important programs, projects, or pilots, or practices, put on a different color and put those in. So those aren't the people. Those are the things that kind of hold the people together. And then also, you know, as you're thinking about what's missing, like Cassie said, well, who's doing the dissolving? Well, no one, you know, all right, no one. You know, who's doing the coordination of all the service team? Well, that's not happening right now. Now, how is the problems that the Solve It people are experiencing? How are those being recorded so they can be managed to, you know, improve the system? Well, that's not happening. So those things that aren't happening that probably need to happen, you know, consider putting that on another color. So don't overcome. I'm just trying to kind of give you an example, but that would turn into the counseling counts piece that we saw earlier. Green people were those that were existing before we started. The yellow were the new stakeholders we were going to have to bring on board to make this happen. The blue were some projects and some things that we knew we were going to have to put in place if we were going to make this kind of whole. And then we know we needed some system leadership, which we didn't have, if we were going to coordinate this between the school and the community itself. So that was all new, and we had to put that in place. There you go. So that would be that example if you did something like that. So I gave you 2 examples that hopefully just kind of say, well, what does this kind of look like? You start with the legend on the right, and you put it out. When you realize you need a different color, just write it out, put it to your legend, and layer that level in. But try to take a couple passes rather than just a plain stakeholder map at this, and kind of see, you know, play around with it. Use some creativity and see if you kind of built it out. Due date, November 27th. Apologize, it's a little bit earlier in the thing, but let's see if we can kind of get them in on that. The good thing, because they are pictures, if you get them in a little bit later than that, I can probably accommodate them and get them into the presentation. So with that, let me ask, what questions might you have about the practice assignment? As always, the practice assignment's in a PDF, just those last slides at the root level, so you don't have to go through all my slides to find it. It is there at the root level itself where you can begin to capture it. And as Amber, I know, always sends kind of the reminder email, she tries to connect to that as well. Let me address questions that you have about it. Many of you are really close. As the work that we saw today, you're really, really close.
I have
So,
one question.
yeah.
So the recording for today, do you know how soon that would be available? That would be helpful since it's on the 27th to have earlier rather than later.
I'm gonna try to get it done this week because we have an institute next week. So I would bank, you know, by Friday, I'll have it up and
Perfect.
running.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kelly. Good question. Other questions?
Jack, I had a question. You mentioned about existing stakeholders and new stakeholders, right? So what is the difference between that? New stakeholders is somebody we think can do, or like, what is the difference between the two?
Well, I think, you know, the key distinction, but who are the people that are currently engaged in the work that we're doing right now? Yeah, you could use it. Again, these are suggestions or recommendations. If you do have people engaged, you know, if no one's engaged, one color is going to do you fine. But those who are currently engaged in doing these kinds of activities, you could put in one color. Those that you're like, you know, if we really had a design team, we would want to also have, right, some skills around this and some skills around the facilitation and some project, you know, pilot project leads. Those would be new people that we just don't have. Think back, if you would, Manisha, to the counseling thing when I talked the leadership team. The
Mhm.
leadership team, right, has full-time, daytime jobs. So we knew we had to hire a few coordinators to pull this together on a day-by-day basis and to work
Okay.
exclusively on the system. Those would have been the new folks that we recommend, that we realized we had to have.
Okay.
That
Okay.
makes sense?
Yeah, it does.
What's missing, right? Who else needs to be at the table that
Right.
has to be engaged to make that activity work?
Mhm. Okay, thanks.
Mm-hmm. Other questions? Gino,
I'll
we're
just
always available. Yes?
Yeah, I'll
David?
just make a quick note. I mean, I know
Please.
there's been some sensitivity about putting real people's names on these maps. You know, you don't want to out folks and all that kind of things. I mean, one, I'll say that, you know, it will be kind of kept confidential here. We don't take these maps and post them on LinkedIn and say, hey, look, great, this person has did something, and, you know, anything like that. But of course, if you're still hyper mindful of that, and you have some sensitivity, you know, consider, you know, some pseudonyms that you have your own backup key. I do that sometimes when I've been in similar tricky situations and I need to get something mapped out, like for my own brain, but no other people are going to see it, you know, have a little, you know, decoder key or something like that. Just, I don't want that to be a barrier for some folks. And I know you're mindful of, you know, sensitivity, local kind of relationships.
Good advice. And as Kelly and Joyce said, they presented theirs with an organization, but still had a deeper list, which they didn't show. That's fine. I'm just encouraging you, get as deep as you can. Put on the map what you want. But see if we can go a little bit deeper. And like I said, do try to unpack very large, like you know, Dr. Robert, like the school corporation. You know, I mean, you could probably unpack that in 15 different layers based upon, you know, what's kind of going on there. United Way's big not-for-profit, you know, shell entity. I mean, so don't be afraid to unpack things that you have to unpack to get there. So yeah, you're going to try to bring these things together now and do your very best to kind of just draw where you think things are. You can use a different color to put some future things that you think need to be there. But just do your best to try to say, where are we at with this system? What do I know? Who's there? What else needs to happen? Just so we can kind of get a current state of where you're thinking it sits and where the directionality needs to go. And that will set up the map that we need to get to the practices. Make sense? All right, as soon as you get the questions, and get them over to us as soon as possible. Thank you so much. You're through the approach. It's pretty harmless. I think we'll be into the practices next time we meet on the area, trying to bring that kind of approach to life. But again, the key thing of the approach message was, you know, these are 3 questions I think any collaborative should be able to address or probably should consider. It's never too late to have the discussion about what problem are we addressing? What are its big sub problems? What kinds of problems are they? How do we want to approach them? And how do we want to organize ourselves? You know, those are the critical questions around any kind of collaboration itself. And I think the pre-work that needs to be done or needs to be done on an existing collaborative sometimes just to move it forward if it feels stuck. So I think those are the critical pieces. There are 3 questions we examine. They're pretty important. We'll adjourn to office hour. Anything from Amber? Anything from Dakota on parting? All right, everyone, have a really good month. It's going to fly by with the holidays approaching. So be best, take care, stay safe, stay healthy, and we'll adjourn to office hours at this point. Thanks.